Which way is north? See the best in each other, get the best in each other. It's a simple principle, and that's the core of the Which Way is North podcast. These are conversations that seek to find and to hold and to play with the best in all of the people that come on. The best isn't something that sits in our title, our name, or oftentimes the externalities that we use to make ourselves known in the world. In fact, sometimes I would even go so far as to say that the pressures and expectations around those titles, those names, can be a barrier to who it is that we really are. And that doesn't have to be a big mythic thing. Sometimes we just want to be somebody different on one day than we are on another. And that freedom to step into and explore an authentic version of ourselves, we don't really have a lot of spaces for that. There's something almost anti-algorithmic about the conversations that take place in podcasts. Somehow they seem buffered, they seem protected for the most part from the influences that guide the things that we want to share, the things that we want to say, the things that we want to create in order to be seen and heard. And that's what drew me to this format, to this idea of sitting with people, having a conversation, and trying as best as we can to find that sacred essence that words like authentic really point to, but that we're afraid to really show, to really share, to really say. I've been on a lot of podcasts. It's one of the privileges of my path and my career. And candidly, I've basically always been selling something when I'm on these podcasts. And that's how the economics of it work. You come into these carrying news or something noteworthy, and that helps the host of the podcast build an audience or produce some relevant content, participate in the cultural cycle. That has its importance, to be sure. But sometimes the obligations related to the news and noteworthiness that we carry disincentivizes us to share who we really are and how we're really feeling at any given time. So this is a space that integrates what I learned from my experiences being on the other side of the microphone in different podcasts. And it also takes something very particular and very important that I learned from my time at Reddit, which is that people really ought to be the masters of their identity. And it's not an extreme. This is not a binary or polarized thing. That doesn't mean that one needs to choose anonymity or the opposite, full transparency and disclosure. It's about having the choice. Because when people have the choice to either brandish the name on their driver's license, the name that will be a part of their legacy, their genealogy, the public record, whatever documentation you want to point to ascribe value to that name, the title. It's important to step into that sometimes, but sometimes you want to allow yourself to stretch out behind a different mask or do your best to reveal who you are without a mask entirely. And so in each of these conversations, we are starting with a simple prompt of how do you want to be referred to in this conversation? I'm using an archetypal framework and a very loose archetypal framework at that, not, taking a hard and fast approach that it's got to be Jungian or it's got to be from the tarot or it's got to be, from this system. It's more playful, more fun to allow people to name the archetype, the avatar that suits them for that moment at that time. That is something that I think has really been at the heart of the internet. And what I learned is at the heart of Reddit, that these are these places where people can come in and say, like, this is my name here in this space. And it gives you mastery of your identity so that you can decide who you are in this context. And that empowerment enables you to approach a moment, to approach a conversation, to approach a creative act with, I think, a higher degree of intentionality, because it disobligates you from everything else that comes with your name, whoever you are. Then after that, the format of the discussions is based upon the principles in Which Way is North, which is my book and my meditation method, my advising method that I work with a lot of creatives, a lot of high performers, a lot of just people in general on. And it's structured with 7 directions that have 7 what I call strategically open questions. You know, the quest is in the question, right? Questions start conversations, answers end them. And so each of these 7 different directions has a question ascribed to it. What is in front of you? What is behind you? What do you rest upon? What shines upon you? What do you receive? What do you give? And then finally, what is in your heart? The 7th direction that is triangulated, located at the intersection, at the nexus point between the other 6. It's a format that I hold on to pretty loosely. I'm not doggedly trying to stay on that frame. In fact, in some of these conversations, I reorder the questions because the natural flow of the conversation is calling for one of the questions to be asked before the others. That's how these systems really ought to work, not to be held on to too tightly, but to be scaffolding for something more organic, more human, more natural. And that's the way that creativity really shines, is when you allow it to use that scaffolding on its terms, not on the scaffolding's terms. We've brought in a lot of amazing people into these conversations. I would say it's an activation of what has been the greatest joy of my career. And honestly, I think the truest through line in my career. I basically just talk with people all the time. On any given day, I'm probably getting coffee with somebody somewhere, or having some, Zoom or Google Hangout video call to just connect and drop into a conversation and get to their humanity, get to whatever it is that is driving them, whatever it is that they're passionate about. I think I'm notorious for stepping into business conversations and then just completely sidewinding it with something that is a little bit more, I guess, just human, something that is, pressing. At the time of this recording, for example, in Los Angeles, we are all emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually recovering from the experience of these fires. I absolutely want to talk with people about how they're doing with that more than whatever project it is that we are, coming together ostensibly to really talk about. And I find that being in that truth, being in that authenticity of connection leads to something more important and actually more valuable in the end. So I suppose in a way, these podcasts are sharing what I have learned and valued the most about the art of conversation as a human navigating the creative world and the business world in ways that at the beginning I thought I wasn't supposed to, but now here in the thick of it, I realize is the most important thing. And so my hope is that at the very least, some of these conversations might model odd but valuable ways to show up for each other. This is going to be an experiment, and it's going to unfold. It's going to adapt over time. The audio is going to be mostly field recordings. So I have these microphones that are very unobtrusive. You can kind of clip them on your shirt wherever you are. And what's important to me about that is that these conversations are able to take place in people's important spaces, or in, serendipitous, synchronistic environments where we happen to connect, because that's where these truly special conversations take place. They don't necessarily take place in these stodgy, structured settings. They take place in areas where there are birds, where there's breezes, where there's the, cacophony of a cafe, where you're out there in the world. And that is what I'm endeavoring to bring into, again, this protected space of the media format of the podcast that seems to carry some immunity in some way to the algorithmic tides. At the opening of every episode is a sound of nature. And this came from a really interesting place. It's an example of the kind of jewel that you can get from the approach of not trying to overly structure things. Being a musician, I was thinking for a long time, like, how do I create an intro for my podcast that is like the right kind of music that sets the right kind of tone? And I was talking with my wife about it, and she mentioned that she had this recording of these birds up in an island in the Pacific Northwest where she had gone on a trip. And that trip happened to be during this immense solar flare that created this cascade of aurora all over the planet. Some of you might remember that. It was this stunning moment of just natural wonder. And I remember I was still in LA, and I was getting a tattoo on my left forearm of some of the symbols from my book to really mark that moment. And I felt like I was infusing, the ink with the energy of these solar flares. So while that was happening, she was recording these birds up in the far north. And it's this deeply natural soundscape. The name of the book, the name of the podcast is Which Way is North? And it doesn't really attempt to answer that other than to point you towards your heart. But as far as a sound that articulates something we ought to set our compasses to, I can't think of anything better than that. Every episode is going to begin with that, and every episode is going to have an image that captures the character of the person as they've decided that they want to be identified as in that conversation. And for many of them, that's going to be an archetype. For many of them, that's going to be their name. My intention is to have all manner of people that sometimes they are choosing to do one or the other. I hope that on this podcast that somebody comes on with an enormous audience and they don't bring that audience and they don't bring that name with them, because I think that would be an example of exactly the kind of liberating feeling that can lead to a deeper and more profound human conversation that can teach all of us a lot more. If you are interested in being one of these people, please reach out to me. The only criteria is that you're human and you're willing to show up as that. And with that in mind, I think that that's reasonable criteria as a listener as well, to use your time with this podcast as an invitation to step into your humanity, because that's what I'm asking for. And I don't know how many other places are doing the same. So let's allow at least this space to call that out of us and see what we can do with it together.